Good morning. Today is August 26th, 2024. And this week I wanted to talk about specifically calculating our compensation on the purchase and sale agreement. So in this class, I want to talk specifically about the things to write on the purchase and sale to make sure we are communicating what our compensation is going to be, who's going to pay for it, and how that's going to work, because this directly affects our closing statements, and we need to make our buyers and sellers aware of the consequences for writing those things in those boxes. So as part of the conversation based on the purchase and sale, we will be touching on the listing agreement, which is Form 1A. Form 21, which is the purchase and sale. We'll be referencing our buyer agreement and talking about the 41C, which is the buyer's credit of compensation. So first and foremost, I wanted to pull up the listing agreement. So we are all going to have one of these at some point. And I wanted to just note here that the compensation has been decoupled. And by decoupling, that means we're going to be looking at it as two separate entities on their own. So I color coded them so we could kind of get a little bit more of a visual on what that means. Everything in 7A is going to reflect what the listing firm's compensation is. So that could be the number or percentage you put in 7A. And if the buyer is unrepresented, the 7AII is going to be the total compensation that you as the listing agent will receive. Now, 7AI is pretty self-explanatory and straightforward because we've been doing this one forever. The one thing to note is that if you are going to be putting something in the second option, this will be the total amount that you're going to receive if you are the listing agent and an unrepresented buyer comes to you. Now, keep in mind too, this is unrepresented. This is not a dual agency. This is where the buyer has zero representation. So if left blank, you as the listing agent are going to be receiving no additional compensation to help the unrepresented buyer. If you want additional compensation, then your total number goes in 7AII. On the flip side, on the buyer side, we're going to kind of look at this in the green. This is the side that's going to go on the closing statement for the buyer agent side. This is the offer of compensation that's going to be listed on the Northwest MLS. And just for the purpose of this discussion right here and now, I'm not going to be looking at the other two options that they've added. I'm only going to be looking at what happens if we need to put a number in here. So the buyer's compensation is going to go in section BI. That will be the percentage or dollar amount that your seller is offering to a buyer's agent if they should come with their own buyer. BII is going to be what happens if you find the buyer, you have a buyer representation agreement, and you bring that buyer to your own listing. So keep in mind, when you're doing a dual agency or a limited dual agency, this means you have to have in place a contract for compensation with the seller and a contract for compensation with the buyer. Now, because they are decoupled, what it will default to is if you are on the buyer side, you get buyer's offer of compensation to negotiate with. And as the listing agent, you also get listing agent's compensation. So those numbers are going to stay separate, but be totaled up at the end as a check to you. Other than that, other than you receiving that check, there's no other place that will put those together in any other place. The HUD's going to be separate. These are going to be separate thoughts, although you will be receiving both because you have representation for both places. Nothing in B is added with A. B is completely separate. So in BI, you can put your dollar amount or percentage. And if you want to receive a different amount than the buy side plus the listing side as the dual compensation, that number is going to be written in BII. And I'm going to have specific examples of this later down the slides. But an example would be, say I want $10,000 to be offered to a buyer's agent and $10,000 for the listing agent. Now, if left alone, it would be just like it has been in our past. You would get the $10,000 to represent the buyer, and you'd get the $10,000 to represent the seller if you were a limited dual agent. What they've done here is they've given the option for that seller to maybe come up with a different number if that's the case. So if the number is different than adding buy side plus sell side, then you can go ahead and put something else in BII. Listing compensation. Like I said, it's going to be the same that it always has. The buy side, being unrepresented, is the only place here that we will add. So if you have offered to do compensation for $10,000 and told that seller, you know what, if a buyer comes unrepresented, I'm going to charge $15,000 total, then you can go ahead and put $15,000 in section 7AII. Because at the end of the contract and at the end of the transaction, the side being paid to the listing firm is going to reflect that $15,000. Now, as the buyer broker compensation, this is the part that's going to be filled in our purchase and sale agreement as that offer. It will be the offer of compensation they've decided. So if they are offering $10,000 to a buyer's agent, that will get put in that place. Now, the one thing that has kind of been a little bit changed, but this still hasn't changed over the last couple years, is that if you are a dual agent, what it will do on the purchase and sale agreement is show the total compensation that you would receive having been a dual agent, because the new law says that any compensation that's being offered has to be disclosed in our purchase and sale agreement. So if you are receiving $10,000 for the buy side plus $10,000 for the listing side, and on the purchase and sale agreement, you are noting that you are representing both buy side and listing side, then the amount that you can put as the offered compensation from that seller in that situation, because they would have consented, would be those two numbers put together at $20,000. So I just wanted to kind of just go over really in detail how to write these up, right? So offer of compensation, here's what the seller is offering to the buyer. Now, if the listing broker is also the limited dual agent, you can either write in the number here, or like I said, leave it blank, and it just defaults back to what is being offered currently to the buyer broker. Because what we're trying to keep in mind is any buyer broker that comes to the table will have this offer of compensation. You, being a buyer broker as well, are considered any other broker that has come to the table with that offer. Buyer broker compensation, if just coming to the table from another person, not you, this is not a limited dual agent situation. So when your seller offers $10,000 and you go to write up the purchase and sale agreement, the Northwest MLS will reflect the $10,000. So on the purchase and sale on line 17A, it would get filled in for the offer of compensation that that seller has said that they would offer any buyer that came. Now, if you are the limited dual, with our example here, we have $10,000 for listing agent, $10,000 for buyer's agent, and nothing has changed. There's no extra or less than that a dual agent would receive, because that agent would be receiving both compensation from listing and buying. You would actually add in the total amount of compensation that the broker would be receiving in line 17. If the seller says, I want the buyer to request the compensation in their offer, it's going to show up just like this. You don't write any numbers in 17A that are not already offered by the seller. This is a disclosure of what the seller has offered a buyer broker, if anything at all. And if there is no offer of compensation, the word none will be displayed in the listing on the Northwest MLS. Thus, any offer that's written up on this needs to have the word none when it comes to the seller's current offer. Now, we do get to negotiate this. So how do we negotiate this? Well, that's going to be 17B. We're not going to touch 17A because that is currently what the seller has offered to pay. We are going to do all of our negotiation in 17B. So 17A is what the seller has offered to pay. 17B is what we are going to be asking that seller to pay. If this space is left blank, then that means we are asking the seller to pay none of the compensation. That doesn't mean that you just don't get paid. That means that your buyer is on the hook because everybody would have signed a buyer agreement stating specifically that if the seller does not pay the compensation, then it is the responsibility of your buyer. So in all situations, you should have a number in that space or be prepared for the conversation that your buyer is going to be taking care of that. If you decide between you and your buyer that you want the buyer to cover your compensation, put the number 0 in here. So at least there's some sort of a conversation and a record of this, because after this point, your buyer still does have to sign your disbursement to be paid and approve that number as well. So when we look at that space, we have to reference our buyer agreement, which is Form 41. Everything that's written in this amount to be paid by seller has to either match your Form 41 or anything that's in excess of what you have agreed to needs to be either credited to the buyer or back to the seller. We cannot accept compensation more than what we have been agreed to accept. So everything has to match our Form 41. Now, when we fill out our Form 41, we are going to go ahead and negotiate either a percentage or a dollar amount. And for this and the fact that it is recorded, I'm using dollar amounts. So in my example here, the buyer and the buyer's agent have agreed to a dollar amount of $20,000. Now, if there is an odd situation, we've given the buyer flexibility to talk about what happens if. So Section 5A is what you're going to be paid as the buyer broker for just representing that buyer in what I want to call a normal transaction from the Northwest MLS. Now, it is possible that you could be a dual agent. And if you do happen to be a dual agent, you can discuss what that means for your buyer. The buy side and the sell side both have to consent to limited dual agency in order for you to use this option. So again, if you don't have consent to do this, you might as well not even fill it in because that conversation really doesn't need to happen without the consent. We've also have the option now of dealing with FSBOs. So we had forever the seller representation form when we wanted to represent the seller and they found a buyer, but there was never an option before this that allowed us to negotiate a difference in compensation if we were helping our buyer find a for sale by owner. So that's something that the two of you can go ahead and discuss. It may be something that you put in additional work to because remember, a seller doesn't have representation. So you'll need to keep communication, somehow negotiate, and schedule inspections. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into representing one party and then working with another party without representation, just as there is an unrepresented buyer. So this option of 5C gives the opportunity, I guess, to decide if your compensation pay is going to be different than your originally agreed buyer comp of, in this example, 20,000. In all of our conversations, we do need to make sure that we are letting our clients know that this offer of compensation from the seller is not required. And luckily, we know that in our industry, we've stayed pretty consistent with what has been offered. And these are going to be our talking points too, because we may have buyers that come with a little bit of hesitation, not knowing what to expect if they don't. The important thing to remember about having this buyer agreement in place is that it gives us the right to also negotiate what that is. And it gives us the opportunity to negotiate some of that being paid with the help of the seller. So whether an offer is given or not, there is always the opportunity to negotiate that. So when we negotiate, I came up with this really, really awesome algebraic problem here. 17A minus 17B equals 41C. 17A is what the seller is offering. 17B is what the seller is going to be paying you. And if there's any difference in that at all, you'll want to make note of that with a 41C. 41C is titled the Addendum for Buyer Credit. But it actually does give us more flexibility than just giving a credit to the buyer. We could use the other box and we could allocate those differences to go back to the seller. In any regard, it's best to document every single dollar amount that is being offered of compensation. Leaving things ambiguous, I think, is just going to create more confusion. So if you're giving something back to the seller, go ahead and check the other box and write in how much of that compensation that the seller is offering is going to be credited back to seller. You do have the option too, as the buyer, to credit it to the buyer. And if the amount exceeds what their lender allows, you can discuss what happens with the difference in that money. You can have that be applied towards the purchase price, or you can just let the seller retain whatever's left over. These are conversations that you're going to be having directly with your buyer on, of course, a case-by-case basis. But this is where we do those things. So here's the big part, writing it up. I went over the forms pretty quickly because the purpose of today is going to be, how do I write things up in certain situations? So I tried to cover as many situations as I could possibly think with very specific examples. We are going to be writing it up. This is the form 21 on line 17. Now, it's not the same line number on different purchase and sale agreements. So don't necessarily reference line 17 A and B, but rather the bullet point that says buyer broker compensation. Before we go into our specific examples, I just wanted to kind of reiterate 17A is what the listing says. We are not changing that at all from what it says. If there's nothing listed, because now we do have the option of leaving it blank, you can write NA in the seller's offer, if any, because there was nothing written in there. Don't leave any of these spaces with nothing written. And 17B is what you get paid by seller. So A, what's being offered, B, what you're asking the seller to actually pay. And if there's a difference in any of this, or even if you are asking the seller to be paid the same amount, but you yourself are accepting less, we want to go ahead and acknowledge where the remaining part of those funds are going. Keep in mind, all money has to be accounted for, and any offer of compensation has to be disclosed in the purchase and sale agreement. So here are some examples. Number one, the listing offers $10,000 and you have a buyer agreement for $25,000. In this situation, what this line means is the seller's offering 10 and you're asking the seller to pay 25. That payment of 25 is going to go to you because there is an addendum, or there's no addendum for a buyer credit. So you're asking that seller to pay you as the agent the remaining part of the compensation to equal 25,000. Next example, the listing offers 30,000. You have a buyer agreement signed for 30,000. In this situation, the seller, you're going to be asking the seller to cover the compensation because they've offered to in the listing. So their offer in the listing is $30,000. And you are asking them to pay you the $30,000 that they have offered to pay a buyer broker. Next one is, what if it says request an offer and you have a buyer agreement signed for $25,000? Well, if it's request an offer and you want $25,000, you cannot ask for more than $25,000. So in this case, request for offer was in the listing and you are asking that seller to fully fund the $25,000. Same with none. If the listing offers no compensation, it will show up as none. And if you have a buyer agreement signed for $30,000, you can ask the seller to pay the $30,000 by writing it in 17B. Now, none of these have the addendum for buyer credit, meaning all of that compensation being asked to be paid for is going to go to the agent, not the buyer. So let's talk about what we want to do if we want to give something back to our buyer. Say the listing is offering $30,000. We have an agreement signed for $25,000, but you want your buyer to be able to take advantage of the full offer that the seller is giving. In this situation, we would use $30,000 because that's what the listing is offering. We would ask the seller to pay our compensation of $25,000. And with the discrepancy of $5,000, we would check the addendum for buyer credit and note on there that we want the extra $5,000 to go towards the buyer. If the listing offers $30,000 and we have a buyer agreement for $15,000, the same thing applies. We're going to go ahead and note the offer of compensation from the listing at $30,000. Then our buyer agreement has been signed for $15,000 and we want our buyer to be able to take advantage of the additional monies that the seller has already offered to pay. So we are going to write $15,000 to be paid to us and account for the difference by the buyer credit addendum showing the additional $15,000 to be paid to buyer. Yes, Ashley.
Thank you. So if there is no compensation, listed in this in the like number 17, number 3 down here, it says request an offer 25,000. So if we wanted to do the same thing here, and then also let's say our agreement with our buyers 30,000, but we're asking for our brokerage to be compensated 25, can we click addendum for buyer credit and do a credit to the buyer too, even if it says like request an offer? Like if it's 30,000, for example, we can ask for 5 to go to the buyer.
Yes. The one thing to keep in mind is that we ourselves as agents cannot accept any more than our buyer agreement has been written.
Okay. But if it's at 30 and we ask for 25, we can ask for the credit to go in the addendum, of course. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. If your buyer agreement is signed for 25, you can ask for 30 with a credit of, 5,000 to the buyer, because we are not accepting any more than what our buyer agreement says. But we can't negotiate. I guess what I'm trying to say is we can't negotiate our own compensation to be higher than what we've signed our buyer agreement for.
Yeah, I was just thinking if it says request an offer,
right?
Let's say our agreement is 30,000, or let's just say it's 25 like you have, and then I can also credit back 5,000 if our agreement said 30.
You could, but let's think about this a little bit more creatively as well. What is your $5,000 going to go towards? Is it going to go towards your lending costs? Because if so, instead of maybe dealing with that on the compensation line, I would probably suggest putting it in your financing addendum.
Okay.
Because this is all about compensation itself. And if the end goal is to put it into financing, you have the option of putting it into financing without quite muddying up your buyer agreement, or anything else that might happen because of this.
So this would just be the credit for the buyer, but if we want it to go towards like a buy down or a closing costs, it would go in financing.
I would really suggest writing that in a separate addendum.
Okay.
Because what we're trying to do here is negotiate the compensation itself, And when there's more that's being offered than what you're okay, like, than what you've agreed to accept, you can say what happens to that difference. But if you're only using this to negotiate a credit somewhere else, I would just suggest negotiating that credit elsewhere to begin with.
But will we still have to mark it in this purchase and sale regardless of the financing addendum?
No, because this is the compensation
Okay,
disclosure right here. So it's what you're being paid. It would be the same thing as we've done before by asking for a seller credit in financing or putting on a 34 that the seller is going to, credit buyer $5,000 towards closing cost or purchase price or whatever it may be.
that makes
Yeah, it would be more simple just to keep it out of this conversation. Now, if you already have something signed in place that your buyer's on the hook for $30,000, sure, you can go ahead and write $30,000 because your buyer's already on the hook and you're going to have to either change your buyer agreement or put somewhere else. I mean, it's the same amount of steps. So
Yeah.
say you just can't accept more than your buyer agreement has been signed for.
Okay.
So if your buyer agreement's signed for 30,000 and you want to give 5,000 back, then you can write 30,000 in this line 17B with a credit of 5,000 back to buyer. Or if your buyer agreement's already signed for 25,000 and you want the seller to give a credit somewhere else, is like, well, you want to give the buyer a credit for financing, then you can use your 22A in your closing costs. You can use a blank form 34 for the closing costs. You can pretty much write it a few different places. The general rule is, the Washington state rule is it has to be disclosed. So we just can't hide where any money is coming from to us. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I have a little bit more clarity on it. I think it's just going to be repetition,
Yes.
So,
That's what I'm trying to hopefully think of as many examples as possible. Now we can go ahead and do credit, and I have my upcoming slides are more about buyer credits. So the last example on this one is when nothing is offered, but we want to go ahead and ask the seller to pay our 30,000 that we have a buyer agreement signed for. It's done the same way here. Because we already have our buyer agreement signed and because they're not offering more than our buyer agreement, it would be cleaner in these two situations to just use a separate addendum to ask the seller for additional money towards buyer's closing costs. It's only when they do this request and offer and none that you have to worry about because they didn't offer more to begin with. You're just negotiating it from the compensation and then giving it right back to the buyer. So for simplicity, I would just ask for it a different place. If you need to change your buyer agreement, you can also do that. So there's a couple ways that you can handle that. When we have a buyer agreement, I just wanted to pull up what that looks like because the listing offers 30. Buyer agreement is signed for 25. You're going to have 17A at 30, 17B at 25. And because there's a difference between the two of those, like my fun little algebraic equation, 17A minus 17B equals the need for 41C. So we're going to have to put in that addendum. And how do we know how much? Well, we know how much because it says 30 for one and 25 for the other. So that being disclosed that they're offering 30, we're asking for 25, and then we want the remaining part to be for the buyer, closes up that math. Now, the other column can definitely be used to clarify that. We can say in the other, if we so choose, 30,000 offered compensation, 25,000 to be paid to buyer broker, $5,000 to be credited to buyer. We can bullet point out exactly what that means for clarity. And maybe we have to for a little while until everybody gets on the same page as far as what this means. But this is the way to fill it out for a credit to buyer. Because we do want to acknowledge where all of the money is going and all of the money that's been offered by the seller.
So
So
one question,
go
Jen,
ahead.
sorry, I'm really trying to grasp this. So if our buyer's agreement says 25, but the seller's offering 30, then we can, even though our buyer's agreement says 25, we can still ask for that 5 to be credited back to the buyer?
Yes, so you ask for 30, you ask them to pay their full 30. Then you say, basically like you're going to fill it out just as this one, but you're this example right here.
Yeah.
So if your buyer agreement is for 30 and you want to give your buyer 5, you can ask the seller to pay the 30 and give your buyer 5, just like this.
Mhm.
You will also, though, because technically your buyer is still on the hook. So before the transaction closes, between you and your buyer, you need to also amend your buyer agreement that says, I'm only leaving you on the hook for 25, and the seller's already offered to pay the 25. So now, we're free and clear. You could probably also do in the other box, we just can't accept, we can't accept more than we've been asked to pay. You could accept the full 30 right here. And then you could, in a separate addendum, write buyer's agent shall credit buyer $5,000. So it comes out of, the same places. At the end of the day, you're walking away with the same amount of money. It's 100% about just disclosing where it is, who's paying for it, and who's getting it. If you want to credit to seller, you can acknowledge their offer of compensation as 30,000, accept the offer and ask for the seller to pay 15,000. And then in the other box of the buyer credit addendum, you can offer the $15,000 credit back to the seller. Or you could do this on a blank 34 even, because it's going to seller. It's not necessarily a credit to the buyer. But again, we're just acknowledging that the seller's offering 30 and we are only asking the seller to pay 15. And then we're stating what happens with the remaining money. If you do leave it blank, there is a default in that form that just says that it goes back to seller. In the addendum for buyer credit, if anything's unchecked, it goes back to seller. For additional monies, don't leave this the way this is. I believe that right now, especially with these new changes, there's going to be too much confusion with what happens to the remaining money. So if there's a difference at all in this, please explain in your contract what happens to that difference. And then remember what happens if we leave it blank. Well, the offer of compensation from the seller based on the listing was 30,000. The amount in 17B is what we're asking that seller to pay, and all compensation has to be disclosed in our purchase and sale agreement. So if left blank, the seller is completely off the hook for paying your compensation and it's going to fall back on your buyer. So be a good agent and don't forget this step. And if it truly is 0, write the number 0 in there. I wanted to talk about what happens if you are a dual agent. So I pulled a listing agreement and my scenario is 20,000 for the list side, 20,000 for the buy side. If you are representing that dual agency, then your offer of compensation, because you are collecting that much money, is going to be $40,000. And in my example, we would be asking the seller to pay the $40,000. This is the only time that you're going to add in these two sections, is if the total offer of compensation to be paid for the purchase and sale agreement is for dual agency. It will also affect unrepresented buyer. So if the listing agent writes up an offer for unrepresented buyer, that number would go where this 40,000 is as well. Because according to the listing agreement, the offer of compensation for that scenario would be that amount of money. And then in a buying situation, it would also be the same, but it would not go on seller's offer. If you do a FSBO, there is no offer of compensation, so that number is 0 or NA. And then your amount being requested is going to reflect what you talked about on your buyer agreement for representing a for sale by owner. Here's another example of dual agency. What if I'm a dual agent? Well, in this situation, because we are decoupling A and B, seller's offer of compensation for the listing agent is 20. They are offering 20,000 to a buyer's agent, but hey, my agent, if you're a dual agent, I want it to be reduced to $10,000 for that side. So instead of receiving $40,000, you would receive what is in line 49 plus what is in line 61. So if you are a limited dual agent and your client has put a different number than BI in BII, you need to go down and look at BII for limited dual agent actual compensation. So what if the listing offers 10,000? Your buyer agreement is signed for 25, but you're willing to reduce your pay. So you can write in the seller's offer at 10. And if you're willing to reduce your pay to 10,000, you can ask that seller to pay the 10,000. When you do this, though, you should immediately amend your 41 to show 10,000 because we don't want to leave the buyer on the hook for the remaining amount. Nor do we want to stress them out that they might be on the hook if we forget to get that in. So if you do adjust the compensation that your buyer is required to pay, please make sure that's done on the 41 as well. All right, I hope that covered all the scenarios, and I'm going to go ahead and go back to some of these slides, and I'd like to openly talk about maybe some real life situations, putting things in these blanks and continue this conversation, but I will be stopping the recording right now, so thank you for listening.